0007 hours. June 6, 1944. Somewhere in the darkness of the Carentan Peninsula, a German paratrooper named Rudolf Thale saw red flares streaking across the sky. Glaring white signal lights burst open above the hedgerows. The drone of aircraft engines, hundreds of them, filled the night air from horizon to horizon. Thale did not hesitate. He had jumped into Crete 3 years earlier. He knew what those lights meant. He ran to the command post of Major Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heydte and reported what he had seen. Von der Heydte, a veteran of 3 fronts and holder of the Knight's Cross, gave a single order: sound the alarm. The men of Fallschirmjaeger Regiment 6 took their positions and waited for the unknown monster. That was the word Thale used. Monster. It was 11 minutes past midnight, German time. Within hours, the men of this elite German parachute regiment would be locked in combat with an enemy they had never faced before. American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division were falling from the sky all around them. Scattered, lost, dropped miles from their intended zones, many tangled in trees or drowning in flooded marshes. By every measure of military logic, these Americans should have been easy prey. They were not. What happened over the next 8 days in the hedgerows of Normandy would change the way German paratroopers thought about their enemy forever. To understand why the opinion of German Fallschirmjaeger carried such weight, you must first understand what these men had been before they ever saw an American. The German parachute force was the creation of one officer, Generaloberst Kurt Student. Born in 1890, a fighter pilot in the First World War, Student had watched Soviet airborne exercises in the 1930s and built Germany's parachute arm from nothing. His paratroopers stunned the world on May 10, 1940, when 70 glider troops seized the Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael, a garrison of nearly 800 defenders on duty that day. At the cost of only 6 German dead, they jumped into Norway, Holland, and over the Corinth Canal. Then came the operation that defined them and nearly destroyed them, Operation Mercury, the airborne invasion of Crete. On May 20, 1941, German paratroopers descended on the island of Crete in the largest airborne assault the world had ever seen. Roughly 22,000 men were committed against 4 objective areas, struck in 2 waves. The morning attacks targeted Maleme and Chania. The afternoon wave hit Rethymno and Heraklion. From the first minutes, things went wrong. Commonwealth and Greek defenders had been warned by ultra-intelligence intercepts. They were ready. New Zealand, Australian, British, and Greek soldiers shot paratroopers out of the sky as they floated down on their unsteerable parachutes. German parachute harnesses at the time required the jumper to exit the aircraft head first, leaving him unable to fire his weapon until he landed and recovered his weapon container from the ground. Many Fallschirmjäger were killed before they ever touched earth. Bodies hung in olive trees. They were dragged through irrigation ditches. Cretan civilians joined the fighting with knives, axes, and ancient rifles. At Maleme airfield, the battle raged for 3 days before the Germans secured the runway, and even then they took it only because Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Andrew of the 22nd New Zealand Battalion withdrew from the critical hill, 107 during the night, after receiving authorization from his brigade. Commander, a decision rooted in broken communications that remains one of the most debated in the history of the campaign. When it was over, Germany held Crete, but the cost was devastating. Between 3,400 and 4,000 German paratroopers were killed or listed as missing. Almost a third of the Junkers 52 transport fleet was destroyed or damaged beyond repair. An entire generation of trained jump instructors and experienced NCOs was gone. Hitler himself told Student at a reception on July 17, 1941, that the days of the parachute troops were over. Student later wrote that Crete was the death of the airborne force. From that day forward, the Fallschirmjäger fought primarily as elite ground infantry. At Leningrad, in the deserts of Tunisia, and in the ruins of Monte Cassino, they earned a reputation as some of the toughest soldiers in any army. But they never conducted another major parachute assault until the very end of the war, and that final attempt would end in humiliation. This is what made the Fallschirmjäger's judgment of the Americans so significant. When a German paratrooper officer said another force was exceptional, he was not offering a casual compliment. He was a man who had jumped into combat, who had watched his comrades die under parachute canopies, who had fought across 3 continents. His standard of comparison was the hardest school of war in existence. Von der Heydte himself had jumped into Crete as commander of 1st Battalion, 3rd Parachute Regiment. His battalion was among the first to enter the town of Chania on the western end of the island, and he won the Knight's Cross for the action on July 9, 1941. He fought in Russia from October 1941. He served with the Ramkay Brigade in North Africa. He became the operations officer of the 2nd Fallschirmjaeger Division. By the time he took command of Fallschirmjaeger Regiment 6 in January of 1944, he had been personally recommended for accelerated promotion by Student himself, who wrote that von der Heydte had put his far-reaching knowledge and thorough experience of parachuting to good use. When such a man wrote about American paratroopers, the world paid attention. The Americans he would face in Normandy had a very different history. The United States Army had no airborne tradition before the war. The first American parachute test platoon was formed in the summer of 1940 under Lieutenant William Ryder. They made the Army's first official jump from a Douglas B-18 bomber over Lawson Field on August 16, 1940. 2 years later, the 82nd Infantry Division was redesignated as the 82nd Airborne Division, and the 101st Airborne Division was activated alongside it. These were brand new formations, built from scratch, with no combat experience. Their first test came in North Africa and Sicily in 1942 and 1943. And the results were mixed at best. During Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, on July 9, 1943, the airborne drops were catastrophically scattered. High winds and inexperienced transport pilots spread paratroopers across 60 miles of Sicilian countryside. On the night of July 11, the disaster deepened. 144 transport aircraft carrying Colonel Reuben Tucker's 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment flew over the Allied invasion fleet. Jittery naval gunners, already on edge from German air attacks, opened fire on the American planes. 23 aircraft were shot down by friendly fire. 81 American paratroopers were killed before they ever saw the enemy. General Eisenhower himself questioned whether large-scale airborne operations were worth the cost, but something remarkable emerged from the chaos. Scattered across Sicily in groups of 3, 5, or 15, cut off from their commanders and their supply lines, the American paratroopers did not hide. They did not surrender. They attacked. Colonel James Gavin's 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment dropped far from its objectives, improvised a defense at Piazza Ridge on July 11, and fought the Hermann Göring Panzer Division to a standstill with a handful of pack howitzers and bazookas. Student himself acknowledged this after the war. In post-war interrogations and interviews conducted for American air power doctrine studies, he assessed that the Allied airborne operation in Sicily had been decisive despite the scattered drops. He stated that without the paratroopers blocking the Hermann Göring division from reaching the beachhead, the seaborne invasion force would likely have been thrown back into the sea. Coming from the founder of German airborne forces, this was an extraordinary endorsement. 3 things made the American paratrooper of 1944 fundamentally different from the average infantryman, and German officers identified each of them in their post-war assessments. First, every American paratrooper was a volunteer. No one was drafted into the airborne. At Camp Toccoa in Georgia, where several parachute infantry regiments were activated and trained between 1942 and 1944, more than 17,000 men reported for duty. Fewer than 6,000 earned the silver wings of a qualified parachutist. That is a washout rate of roughly 2/3. These were men who chose to jump out of airplanes, and who survived a training regime designed to break them before the enemy got the chance. Second, the physical and psychological standards were extreme. Recruits ran the 3 miles up and 3 miles down course on Currahee Mountain, a peak of 1,735 feet, in the foothills of the Georgia Appalachians. The name Currahee came from a Cherokee word meaning stands alone, and the mountain became the defining symbol of airborne training. Men ran it in boots, often multiple times in a single day. Those who fell behind were washed out. There was no second chance. They jumped from 250-foot towers originally built for the 1939 New York World's Fair and erected at Fort Benning. The towers simulated the sensation of a parachute descent, complete with oscillation and wind drift, but without the safety of being inside an aircraft. Men who froze at the top were dropped from the program immediately. They learned the parachute landing fall from platforms and the backs of moving trucks. They practiced hand-to-hand combat, knife fighting, demolitions, and weapons proficiency with every small arm in the Allied and Axis inventories. They qualified after 5 live jumps from aircraft, including at least 1 night jump. The men who made it through were, by regulation, required to demonstrate above-average physical fitness and psychological stability. Those who wore the silver jump wings on their chest had survived a selection process that was deliberately designed to be harder than anything the enemy could do to them. Third, and most importantly, the Americans had developed a doctrine of small unit initiative that no other army in the world could match. Because parachute drops were assumed to scatter, and Sicily had proved this beyond argument, American airborne doctrine deliberately pushed tactical decision-making down to the squad level and even to the individual soldier. Officers were trained to expect to be cut off from higher command. Sergeants were trained to expect to be cut off from their officers. Privates were trained to attack targets of opportunity, even when no orders existed. This philosophy stood in stark contrast to the German military tradition, where initiative existed but was more tightly bound to the chain of command. American paratroopers were taught that the worst thing they could do when isolated was nothing. Find an objective, find other paratroopers, find the enemy, and attack. This was the doctrinal foundation for the German observation, made repeatedly in 1944, that Americans popped up from nowhere, that scattered paratroopers who should have been defending in place instead attacked whatever they found in front of them. Now return to Normandy, June 6, 1944. Of nearly 7,000 men of the 101st Airborne who jumped that night, only a fraction landed on or near their designated drop zones. The 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd suffered the worst dispersion. Only about 25% of its men landed within a mile of the intended drop zone. Many paratroopers drowned in the marshes the Germans had deliberately flooded behind the beaches. Equipment bundles were lost. Radios were smashed. Entire sticks of paratroopers landed in German-occupied villages and were shot to pieces before they could cut free of their harnesses. The famous case of Private John Steele, whose parachute snagged on the church steeple at Sainte-Mère-Église, leaving him dangling helplessly above a firefight, became the iconic image of the airborne chaos that night. 24 hours into the invasion, only about 2,500 men of the 101st and 2,000 of the 82nd were under their division's control, roughly 1/3 of the force that had been committed. For von der Heydte's Fallschirmjaeger Regiment 6, deployed across the Carentan Peninsula, this should have been a gift. The regiment itself was a formidable unit. Its total strength was approximately 4,500 men. The average age of its soldiers was just 17.5 years old. But this did not mean the regiment was green. The cadre, the NCOs, and the company commanders were veterans of Crete, Russia, and North Africa. They had been formed in Normandy in late 1943 and trained relentlessly through the spring of 1944. By any standard short of the legendary 1st Fallschirmjaeger Division at Monte Cassino, they were elite. The Americans were fragmented, disoriented, and scattered across miles of enemy-held territory in the dark. Von der Heydte's 1st Battalion, roughly 1,000 men under Hauptmann Emil Preixkat, marched northeast towards Sainte-Marie-du-Mont and ran headlong into 101st Airborne glider men and dispersed paratroopers in the hedgerows. Lieutenant Eugen Scherer of the 4th Company wrote that a gory battle developed on the disorderly grounds. Within 36 hours, after fighting a combined assault of American paratroopers and tanks, the 1st Battalion was destroyed. About 300 men surrendered. Only 25 reached friendly lines. An entire battalion of elite German paratroopers, veterans trained to the highest standards, wiped out by an enemy that had been on the ground for barely a day and a half. It was here that von der Heydte and his officers began to record what they were seeing. The Americans were dispersed but not paralyzed. Cut-off groups of 3 or 5 paratroopers would simply attack whatever German formation they encountered. Pathfinders appeared with darkened faces. Some wore their hair in mohawk cuts, a custom of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment's demolition section under Sergeant Jake McNeice, known as the Filthy 13. Von der Heydte's men later remarked that these soldiers looked less like the textbook enemy they had expected, and more like figures from some older, wilder kind of warfare. But it was not just bravado that impressed the Germans. Oberfeldwebel Peltz of Fallschirmjaeger Regiment 6 captured a group of American officers early on the first morning. He found them crowded around a map, shining dim flashlights on it, so absorbed in reading that they had not even noticed they were being encircled. They had not set guards. Peltz recorded this observation for the regimental history. These guys were that sure of their victory. This was not admiration for American professionalism. It was astonishment at their confidence. Experienced or not, the Americans behaved as though defeat was simply not a possibility. While the 101st was tearing apart von der Heyde's 1st Battalion, the 82nd Airborne was fighting what the Army historian S.L.A. Marshall would later call probably the bloodiest small unit struggle in the experience of American arms. The 4-day battle for the La Fiere Causeway over the flooded Waal River, west of Sainte-Mère-Église. The objective was a small stone bridge and a 500-metre elevated causeway. The causeway was a narrow, raised road, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles, running across a flooded river valley. On either side of the road, nothing but waist-deep water and marsh. With the Murderette flooded into a 1,000-yard-wide marsh, the bridge and causeway were the only practical east-west route in the sector, and therefore the only route by which German armour from the 91st Air Landing Division and the 1057 Grenadier Regiment could reach Utah Beach. If German tanks crossed that bridge, they could drive directly into the flank of the 4th Infantry Division coming ashore on the beaches. A company, 1st Battalion, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, under 1st Lieutenant John Dolan, seized the manor and the eastern end of the bridge before dawn on the 6th of June. They held it through repeated counterattacks, supported by tanks of the 100th Panzer Replacement Battalion, a training unit equipped with captured French tanks and obsolete Panzer IIIs. Bazooka teams and a single 57mm anti-tank gun stopped the German armour at point-blank range. In one engagement, a German tank rumbled across the bridge with captured American paratroopers walking in front of it, forced to clear mines as human shields, a violation of the laws of war. The American defenders held their fire until the tank crossed, then destroyed it with a bazooka round from less than 30 yards. Sergeant William Owens, leading 15 men after his platoon leader was hit, held the eastern bank for 4 days straight. By June 10, a company, which had landed with 147 paratroopers on the 6th of June, had suffered 46 killed and 81 wounded, an 86% casualty rate. On June 9, glider men finally crossed the causeway under smoke. 35 men died on the bridge and causeway that day alone. Total American killed in the 4-day La Fiere fight exceeded 250. The German testimony from this fight registers the same observation that recurred throughout the Carentan. The Americans, on a stretch of road 500 meters long and roughly 15 feet wide, with nowhere to dig in and nowhere to retreat, would not be moved. The road from Saint-Côme-du-Mont to Carentan ran 4.5 miles along an exposed causeway across marshes. The men of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment called it Purple Heart Lane. By June 10, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole's 3rd Battalion was leading the 101st Airborne's attack on Carentan from the north. Cole was a career paratrooper, born at Fort Sam Houston in 1915, a West Point graduate of 1939. His 265 men were pinned down in front of a farmhouse defended by elements of Fallschirmjaeger Regiment 6. German machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire from positions 150 yards away made movement impossible. German air attacks reportedly killed or wounded dozens of men in I Company in a single pass, effectively destroying the company as a fighting unit. On the morning of June 11, Cole made a decision that entered the history of American arms. He ordered a bayonet charge. He called for smoke, blew his whistle, rose to his feet in front of his battalion with a drawn pistol, and shouted for his men to follow him. Initially, only about 20 men joined the charge. Then Major John Stopka brought up another 50. Then the rest of the battalion, seeing their commander running forward into the fire, followed. Of 265 men who began the attack, 130 became casualties. The German paratroopers of Fallschirmjaeger Regiment 6 were killed in their hedgerows with bayonets and grenades. Cole received the Medal of Honor for this action, awarded posthumously after he was killed by a sniper near Best in Holland on September 18, 1944. No German account from the survivors of the hedgerow facing Cole's charge has surfaced. The men holding that position died there. By June 11, von der Heydte's regiment was running out of everything. Rifle ammunition was being collected from rifle companies and given to machine gun crews because nothing else remained. Major General Maxwell Taylor sent a message in German to von der Heydte demanding capitulation and acknowledging the regiment's courage. One paratrooper commander to another. Von der Heydte refused, bound by Hitler's stand-fast order, but the gesture itself, the professional acknowledgement between elite units, set the tone of the entire Carentan fight. Von der Heydte ordered a withdrawal under cover of darkness to avoid encirclement. This decision nearly cost him his career. The commander of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, SS Brigadeführer Werner Ostendorf, was furious at what he considered an unauthorized retreat and attempted to have von der Heydte arrested. Only the intervention of senior Luftwaffe officers saved him from court-martial. On June 13, his remnants, reinforced with elements of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, counterattacked toward Carentan in what American paratroopers christened the Battle of Bloody Gulch. The German thrust was on the verge of breaking through when First Lieutenant Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, anchored his men against a railroad embankment and held the line until 60 Sherman tanks of Combat Command A, 2nd Armored Division, arrived in the late afternoon and shattered the German assault. It was after Carentan that American paratroopers began calling the men of Fallschirmjaeger Regiment 6 the Lions of Carentan. The nickname was given by the Americans in recognition of their enemy's tenacity, and the Germans accepted it with pride. In interviews collected decades later by historian Volker Grieser for his regimental history, the surviving veterans of Fallschirmjaeger Regiment 6 spoke of the Americans as the most aggressive opponents they had ever met. Grieser asked in 2013 whether the respect was mutual, answered simply. Having also talked to American veterans who had fought against the 6th, they had nothing but good things to say about them, so I would think that they earned their respect. The numbers tell the story of what Carentan cost. By July 1944, Fallschirmjaeger Regiment 6 had reported approximately 3,000 casualties since the 6th of June. By August 10, when the regiment was finally pulled out of the line, von der Heydte's command was 40 men strong, out of the 4,600 it had begun with on the 6th of June. The 101st Airborne's casualties through June 30 were 4,670. 546 killed, 2,217 wounded, 1,907 missing. The 82nd Airborne lost 4,480. Both sides had paid a paratrooper's price, and the survivors knew it. While the 82nd Airborne's main body refitted in England during the spring of 1944, one of its regiments was fighting a different war entirely. The 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, under Colonel Reuben Tucker, had been detached for the Italian campaign and made an amphibious landing at Anzio on January 22, 1944. Tucker was one of the most aggressive regimental commanders in the American Army, a man who drove his troops hard and who expected them to fight the same way he did. At Anzio, the beachhead was a compressed, flat piece of ground barely 7 miles deep and 15 miles wide. There was no room to maneuver. There was no rear area safe from German artillery. For 2 months, the 504th fought a continuous defensive action in conditions that resembled the Western Front of the First World War more than anything else in the Second. They conducted nightly patrols into German lines, ambushed enemy positions, and earned a reputation for never staying where they were expected to be. One of the first presidential unit citations awarded in the European theatre went to the 3rd Battalion of the 504th for its actions at Anzio. It was at Anzio that the most famous German evaluation of any American airborne unit was written. A diary belonging to an unidentified German officer, killed sometime between February 8 and 12, 1944, was recovered by American forces and translated. The key passage entered military folklore. The officer had written that American parachutists, devils in baggy pants, were less than 100 meters from his outpost line. He could not sleep at night. They popped up from nowhere, and he never knew when or how they would strike next. The black-hearted devils seemed to be everywhere. The 504th adopted the phrase as its regimental nickname. The name of the German officer who wrote those words has never been identified. His diary was processed through Fifth Army intelligence channels, and the original German text has been lost. But the name stuck, and it captured something real about how the German soldier experienced the American paratrooper at close range. On September 17, 1944, the largest airborne operation in history was launched, Operation Market Garden. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's plan was audacious in the extreme. 3.5 airborne divisions would seize a series of bridges across the rivers and canals of the occupied Netherlands, creating a corridor 64 miles long through which the British 30 Corps would drive its armour straight into the heart of Germany. If it worked, the war might be over by Christmas. The 101st Airborne dropped at Eindhoven and Veghel to secure the southern bridges. The 82nd Airborne dropped at Nijmegen to capture the massive road and rail bridges over the Waal River, the widest and most heavily defended water obstacle on the corridor. The British 1st Airborne, with the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade attached, dropped at Arnhem, the final bridge, the bridge too far. The American drops were the best of the war. 89% of the 82nd's troops landed within 1,000 meters of their drop zones. It was a vindication of everything the airborne had learned since Sicily. But the Nijmegen Bridge, the second-to-last crossing on the corridor to Arnhem, was held by a reinforced battalion of the 10th SS Panzer Division, with Fallschirmjaeger units defending the approaches. The bridge was a massive steel structure, over 1,600 feet long, and that the Germans had prepared for demolition. Every hour that it remained in German hands was an hour that the British 1st Airborne at Arnhem was being ground to pieces. 2 frontal assaults on September 19 failed. Brigadier General James Gavin, who at 37 was the youngest division commander in the American Army since the Civil War, proposed a solution that stunned even the British. He would send Major Julian Cook's 3rd Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, the Devils in baggy pants of Anzio, across the Waal River in canvas boats, in broad daylight, under the German guns. 26 collapsible British wood and canvas boats arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon on September 20, delayed by traffic on the road the Americans called Hell's Highway. They were 19 feet long with plywood bottoms and canvas sides. The paratroopers of C Company, 307th Airborne Engineer Battalion, who would pilot them, had never seen a boat like them, much less rowed one across half a kilometre of open water under fire. Captain Henry Keep, a former Princeton oarsman and 504th Company commander, described the crossing in a letter. He wrote about defenceless, frail canvas boats jammed to overflowing with men, all striving desperately to cross the Waal as quickly as possible and get to a place where at least they could fight. He said they looked like a bunch of animals, void of dignity and normalcy. Of 260 men who set off in the first wave at 2:57 in the afternoon, 48 were killed on the river and many dozens wounded. German machine guns, mortars, and 20mm anti-aircraft guns poured fire into the flimsy boats from positions on the northern bank and from the road bridge itself. Some boats were hit and sank, spilling their occupants into the fast-flowing current. Men who could not swim went under immediately, dragged down by the weight of their equipment. Others clung to the gunwales of sinking boats and kicked toward the far shore. Some men used rifle butts as paddles when the real paddles were lost or broken or when the men holding them were killed. Of the 26 boats that launched, only 11 returned to ferry a second wave. The men of the 3rd Battalion reached the northern bank, hauled themselves out of the mud, and attacked immediately. They cleared the railroad bridge from the north, while the Grenadier Guards attacked across the road bridge from the south. By late afternoon, approximately 200 to 300 German defenders, having watched the daylight river crossing under their own machine gun fire, came out and surrendered. Some of the German prisoners later told their captors that they had never seen anything like it, that no troops should have been able to make that crossing and survive. The Waal crossing broke the Nijmegen defence and remains one of the most extraordinary small unit actions of the entire Second World War. By December 1944, the 101st Airborne was in rest area at Montmelon-le-Grand, refitting after Holland. The division had been in almost continuous combat since June. Men were catching up on sleep, writing letters, and waiting for replacement equipment. Major General Taylor was in Washington for staff conferences. Then, on the morning of December 16, Hitler launched his Ardennes offensive, what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. 25 German divisions, including elite panzer formations that had been secretly concentrated in the Eifel forests, struck the thinly held American line along a front of 85 miles. The initial blow fell on green and depleted American infantry divisions who were overwhelmed within hours. Entire battalions were encircled and destroyed. Panic began to spread through the American rear areas as German armoured columns punched through toward the Meuse River. The 101st was rushed to Bastogne in open trucks, arriving on December 18 and 19. Many men had no helmets, no winter overcoats, and insufficient ammunition. Some had been on leave in Paris and were pulled out of cafes and bars and loaded onto trucks with whatever they were wearing. They arrived at Bastogne under the temporary command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the divisional artillery commander, and immediately took up defensive positions around the crossroads town. Bastogne was the hub of 7 major roads, and the Germans needed it to sustain their advance. Without Bastogne, the entire southern shoulder of the Bulge offensive would collapse. By December 21, General-Lieutenant Heinrich von Luettwitz's 47th Panzer Corps, including the Panzer Lehr Division, 2nd Panzer Division, and 26th Volksgrenadier Division, had completely encircled the town. Within the perimeter were the 101st Airborne, Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, and assorted supporting units. They were outnumbered roughly 5 to 1. They had no winter clothing adequate to temperatures that plunged well below freezing, dropping as low as -20 degrees Celsius at night with bitter wind chill. They had no air resupply because of overcast skies and no tactical air support. Artillery ammunition was rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day. Surgeons operated by candlelight in cellars. The wounded lay on straw because there were no cots. On the morning of December 22, 4 German officers approached the perimeter under a flag of truce and delivered a typewritten ultimatum. The message, signed only as the German commander but authored by von Luettwitz, demanded the honourable surrender of the encircled town. It warned that 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions were ready to annihilate the American troops. The story of McAuliffe's reply is one of the most documented moments of the war. When first told the Germans wanted to surrender, McAuliffe, half awake, muttered a single word. When Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore corrected him, explaining that the Germans wanted the Americans to surrender, McAuliffe laughed. When his staff debated a formal reply, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the divisional operations officer, said that the general's original remark could not be improved upon. The typed reply, delivered by Colonel Bud Harper, read in full, to the German commander, nuts, the American commander. When the Germans asked Harper to translate, he said, in plain English, go to hell. Von Luettwitz, interrogated by the Army's historical division after the war, appeared chagrined over the fact that he had authored the request. The other German commanders involved all regarded the ultimatum as a military mistake. The 101st held until elements of Combat Command R, 4th Armoured Division, of Patton's 3rd Army, broke through at Assenois shortly before 5 in the evening on December 26. But the fighting did not end with the relief. The battle for Bastogne continued for weeks. The 101st, now reinforced, went on the offensive, attacking through the frozen Bois-Jacques forest toward the village of Foy and beyond. Men fought in snow up to their waists. Foxholes had to be chipped out of frozen ground with bayonets because entrenching tools could not penetrate the frost. Tree bursts from German artillery, shells detonating in the canopy above, sent lethal wooden splinters raining down on men in their holes. Trenchfoot and frostbite claimed nearly as many casualties as enemy fire. Medics worked with frozen plasma bottles tucked under their armpits, trying to warm them enough to be usable. The division's casualties for the entire Bastogne campaign were 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing. No member of the 101st has ever conceded that Patton rescued them. Their motto became, "We do not need to be relieved." While the 101st was holding Bastogne, the Fallschirmjaeger were providing a final, bitter contrast. Von der Heydte, given 8 days to prepare, was ordered to lead Operation Stoesser, a parachute drop behind American lines during the Ardennes offensive. He was provided 800 men scraped together from across the 2nd Parachute Corps. Commanders had been ordered to provide their best soldiers. They sent their worst. Of his own former regiment, Fallschirmjaeger Regiment 6, 150 men disobeyed orders and joined him out of personal loyalty. Von der Heydte later described this command in the bleakest terms, saying that never in his entire career had he been given a unit with less fighting spirit. The drop, on the night of December 16, was the only operational German night airborne drop of the war, and it was a complete failure. About 1,300 paratroopers boarded 112 Junkers transports, but in snowstorms and high winds, only roughly 300 reached the drop zone area. Von der Heydte broke his arm on landing. On December 23, frostbitten and suffering from pneumonia, he surrendered at Monschau. German paratroopers cobbled together at the last minute with predictable results. American paratroopers, holding a road junction town for 10 days at 5-1 odds. The contrast was not lost on the Fallschirmjaeger officers who sat through the post-war interrogations. German assessments of the various Allied airborne forces reveal a clear pattern. The British 1st Airborne, defeated at Arnhem by the 2nd SS Panzer Corps under Obergruppenführer Wilhelm Bittrich, was described as professional, disciplined, and stubborn. The men of the 1st Airborne held the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge for nearly 4 days, under conditions as desperate as anything at Bastogne, and German evaluations acknowledged the courage of Colonel John Frost's battalion in particular. But German officers also noted that the British tended to fight to a position and hold it, rather than attack aggressively when the situation seemed unfavourable. The Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, under Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski, was respected as ferocious in close combat, but committed too late and too lightly equipped at drill to alter the outcome. The Americans were evaluated in fundamentally different terms. The word that recurs in every German account is aggressiveness, a refusal to behave defensively, even when defensive behavior was the only rational choice. German officers noted with frank surprise that isolated American paratroopers who should have been hiding and waiting for rescue were instead attacking whatever enemy they could find. This was not recklessness. It was doctrine, and it was the single quality that, more than any other, separated the American airborne experience from that of every other Allied paratrooper formation in the war. The line from the disastrous 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion drop in North Africa in November 1942, through the friendly fire catastrophe over Sicily, through the bloody beachhead at Anzio, to the precision drops and decisive ground actions of 1944 and 1945, is the line along which the American airborne earned the verdict of its German peers. In Sicily, Eisenhower himself doubted whether massed airborne operations were viable. Major General Matthew Ridgway and Brigadier General Gavin spent the autumn of 1943 fighting that perception within Supreme Headquarters. They argued that the problem in Sicily was not the airborne concept itself, but the execution, the untrained transport pilots, the lack of pathfinders, and the failure of coordination with naval forces. They were right. By Normandy, pathfinders were used, drop zones were better marked, and pilots were trained specifically for night formation flying over hostile territory. The drops were still scattered, but the tactical doctrine of fight where you are with whoever you have got was now embedded so deeply in every paratrooper that the scattering itself became an asset rather than a liability. In Holland, the daylight drops achieved the highest accuracy of the war. By the Bulge, the airborne were the Army's strategic reserve, capable of being trucked into a crisis and holding it against overwhelming odds. They had become the force that commanders reached for when everything else had failed. What the Fallschirmjaeger had become by the end of 1944, elite ground infantry increasingly composed of teenagers and replacements with no jump training, employed as emergency units across collapsing fronts, was precisely what they had once feared the Americans were not. By 1945, Students' 1st Parachute Army was a name on paper commanding men who had never jumped. The Americans, meanwhile, had grown into the role the Germans had vacated. In 1948, contributing to the United States Army's Foreign Military Studies project at Allendorf, von der Heydte wrote a 45-page manuscript. Designated Manuscript B, 839, it was titled A German Parachute Regiment in Normandy. In those pages, the recurring observation is unmistakable. The American paratroopers attacked when they should have hidden. They regrouped under fire when they should have scattered. They fought as improvised squads when their officers were dead or missing. They refused to break. Von der Heydte reflected that his regiment had found itself fighting an enemy that was always advancing, always attacking, even when there was no good reason for him to do either. Volker Grieser, the historian who spent years interviewing the surviving veterans of Fallschirmjaeger Regiment 6 for his regimental history, published in Germany in 2007 and translated into English by Casemate in 2011, summarized what he found. The men who had called themselves the Lions of Carentan, who had fought from Normandy to the end of the war, who had endured some of the heaviest combat any German formation experienced, spoke of the American paratroopers with nothing but respect. They recognized in the Americans something they understood intimately: the willingness to fight beyond reason, beyond calculation, beyond the point where any sensible soldier would stop. This was not the tribute of a weaker force admiring a stronger one. It was the recognition of equals. Two elite paratrooper formations, forged in different nations and different traditions, had met across 4 major engagements in less than a year. The Germans began the war believing themselves the only true paratroopers in Europe. Their own pioneering assault on Crete had cost them so dearly that Hitler forbade them from ever jumping again. They spent the rest of the war fighting on the ground, watching their airborne identity fade. And then, in Normandy, at Anzio, at Nijmegen, and in the frozen forests around Bastogne, they watched a new airborne force do what they could no longer do: jump into the fire, fight scattered and outnumbered, and refuse to be beaten. The German paratroopers' verdict on the American airborne was not given lightly. It was earned at La Fiere, where a company held a bridge at 86% casualties. It was earned on Purple Heart Lane, where Cole's men fixed bayonets and charged into the hedgerows. It was earned on the Waal, where men paddled canvas boats across a river under machine gun fire because no one told them it was impossible. And it was earned at Bastogne, where a one-word answer to a demand for surrender became the most famous reply in the history of the American Army. Roughly 3,000 men of Fallschirmjaeger Regiment 6 became casualties in Normandy. Thousands of American paratroopers joined them in the earth of France, Holland, and Belgium. They were all young. They were all somebody's son. They jumped from aircraft into darkness, into fire, into the unknown, because that is what paratroopers do. And when the survivors of both sides sat down after the war to write their accounts and give their testimony, they did something that enemies rarely do. They honored each other. The lions of Carentan honored the devils in baggy pants. The devils honored the lions, not because war is glorious, it is not, but because the men who fight it, when they fight it with everything they have, deserve to be remembered by those who understand what it cost. That is why German paratroopers said American airborne fought like no one else, because they were the only ones qualified to judge. The Fallschirmjaeger had invented airborne warfare. They had paid its highest price at Crete. They had earned the right, through years of suffering and sacrifice across every front, to tell the world who fought well and who did not. And when they looked across the hedgerows of Normandy, across the flooded fields of Holland, and across the frozen forests of the Ardennes, they saw men who reminded them of themselves. Not copies. Not imitators. Something new. Something that had taken what the Germans pioneered and made it into something the Germans themselves could no longer match. Their judgment, written in the pages of foreign military studies manuscripts, in the interviews collected by historians decades after the guns fell silent, and in the quiet conversations between old soldiers who once tried to kill each other, has never been revised. It stands as one of the most powerful tributes one fighting force has ever paid to another. Not because it was given freely, but because it was earned in the only currency soldiers accept: blood, courage, and the refusal to quit.